Welcome to the debate. When it comes to high-level language testing, specifically the IELTS, well, most people think perfect grammar automatically equals a perfect score. You memorize the vocabulary, you calculate the flawless grammatical structures, and you assume the resulting sum equals a top band.
Right, essentially treating the examiner like a grading machine.
Exactly. But what if that mechanical approach is exactly what is tanking your results? Today, we are looking at a really fascinating tension in language assessment. Does being polite actually boost your speaking score? Or can being overly direct, even if your grammar is technically flawless, inherently harm your results?
And that is based on the source material we are diving into today.
Yeah, it is. And I will be representing the view that politeness isn't just about having good manners. It is actually a literal structural cheat code that forces you to use the advanced language required for higher bands.
And I am taking the exact opposite view. I argue that directness is the ultimate tool for clarity, and treating etiquette as a linguistic metric just encourages candidates to hide behind empty, memorized fluff.
I really want to unpack that because I think a lot of people sitting for these exams share your suspicion. They feel like politeness is somehow fake or, secondary to the real English they are trying to demonstrate.
Because it often sounds fake.
Well, sure, if done poorly. But my stance is that politeness operates as a comprehensive framework for higher scores. When candidates focus exclusively on complex grammar and vocabulary, they deliver these perfectly correct sentences that still somehow completely fail to impress the examiner.
Because they sound like robots?
Because the tone is completely devoid of social awareness. They sound abrupt, they sound dismissive, sometimes they inadvertently sound completely rude.
Okay, but does the rubric actually grade you on being rude?
Indirectly, yes. Using polite language directly impacts the grading criteria because you simply cannot be highly polite using only rudimentary, beginner-level vocabulary. The very act of softening a statement or respectfully disagreeing with a prompt demands sophisticated grammatical structures.
I hear the theory there, but let's look at what communication actually is at its core. I mean, it is information transfer.
Is it just that, though?
In an exam room? Largely yes. The examiner is sitting across the table to assess your ability to convey ideas clearly and effectively in English. They want clear, efficient answers. If you are asked a direct question or presented with a premise, a straightforward statement like, "No, that's wrong," is an incredibly efficient way to transfer that information.
But it is so jarring.
Jarring maybe, but it is grammatically sound, it is entirely unambiguous, the listener knows exactly where you stand immediately. My primary concern with your framework is that by prioritizing this highly subjective concept of politeness, we are essentially rewarding candidates for using unnecessary fluff.
I wouldn't exactly call it fluff.
Well, we run a very real risk of confusing socially conditioned deference with actual measurable linguistic proficiency. If I can say in 3 words what takes you 15, shouldn't my efficiency be rewarded?
That makes sense if you view language purely as data transmission, like, two computers talking to each other. But let's look at it differently. Think of language proficiency as architecture.
Okay, architecture. Go on.
What you are describing, the directness, the basic grammar, the literal vocabulary, that is the structural engineering of the building. It is the steel frame. It keeps the walls up and ensures the building doesn't collapse.
Which is the most important part of the building, I might add.
Sure, but politeness is the architectural design. It is the layout of the rooms, the lighting, the flow of the hallways that allows a person to actually navigate that building smoothly.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right? If communication is about the reception of an idea just as much as the transmission of it, doesn't a perfectly engineered building fail if it's jarring and unpleasant to walk through? Directness might build the walls, but politeness opens the doors. You have to consider the human experience of the examiner.
Well, the architectural analogy is clever, but let's test that design in the actual environment of the exam room.
Let's do it.
Efficiency is great when you are just stating facts about yourself. If we look at the foundational levels of the test, where the focus is almost entirely on the candidate speaking about their own hobbies or routines, the source material brings up a very standard example.
The football example?
Yes, a candidate answering a question by saying, I like playing football. Now, under my framework of structural engineering, that is a perfectly factual, grammatically correct, and highly efficient answer. It does exactly what it needs to do.
It answers the prompt, sure, but it is entirely unremarkable. A machine could spit out that sentence. It doesn't demonstrate proficiency above a fundamental elementary level.
But it is not wrong.
No, but look at the refined alternative provided in the material. I'm really passionate about playing football. There's something about the teamwork that I find really engaging. By expanding the answer to sound more engaging, by offering a piece of their personality to the examiner through a polite conversational tone, the candidate naturally accesses a much richer lexical resource.
Lexical resource, yes. But politeness?
Yes, they move from the basic word like to passionate. They introduce concepts like teamwork and engaging. This isn't just interior decoration. It is demonstrating a significantly broader command of the language.
Hold on, I have to stop you there because I completely disagree with the label you are applying. Is that actually politeness?
Of course it is.
We have to be precise with our definitions. The text also contrasts the basic statement, I like pop music, with the expanded version, I'm quite fond of pop music. There's something about the melodies that really resonates with me.
Which sounds vastly better.
It does, and it does the exact same thing with career goals. Contrasting, I want to be a doctor with, I've always been interested in medicine. I think it would be incredibly rewarding to pursue a career in that field. Now, are these objectively better answers? Absolutely.
Right, they score higher.
They will undeniably score higher on the lexical resource rubric. But they aren't more polite. They are simply more elaborate. They are descriptive. You are conflating elaboration with etiquette to make your argument work.
I can see why it looks like mere elaboration on the surface, but let's dig into why a candidate would choose to elaborate in that specific way. Let's look at another example from the text.
Okay.
When a candidate is describing a negative personal experience, they could easily use the blunt, direct phrasing, I was angry when. But the material suggests a softer, more measured alternative. I felt quite frustrated when.
Yeah, I remember that one.
Now, let me ask you, are they actually being more polite to the examiner by changing that phrase? Or is this just emotional precision?
It is emotional precision, without a doubt. Frustrated is a highly specific state. Angry is just a general overarching umbrella term. Finding the specific state demonstrates a better vocabulary.
Exactly. But why do we seek that precision in a social setting like an exam? Because raw, unmitigated anger is abrupt. It is uncomfortable for the listener.
So you are saying it is about the listener's comfort.
Yes. By choosing frustrated, the candidate is consciously moderating their emotional output for the sake of the listener's comfort. That is the very essence of social politeness. Politeness isn't just saying please and thank you.
I suppose.
It is the medical that drives the candidate toward that more precise vocabulary. By actively trying not to sound abrasive or overly intense to a stranger, the brain is forced to search its mental lexicon for better, more nuanced words. The desire to be socially appropriate is the trigger that displays the advanced linguistic skill.
Okay. I will give you that. The effort to soften a statement, to modulate it for an audience, often requires a broader vocabulary. Frustrated is undeniably a higher band word than angry, and the social friction of the moment might be the catalyst for finding it.
Right.
But we have to be incredibly careful not to confuse the byproduct with the mechanism itself. The examiner gives a higher score because the candidate knows the word frustrated and uses it accurately in a grammatical context.
Sure.
They don't give a higher score because their personal feelings were spared by the softening of the candidate's emotional expression. Efficiency in language often requires directness, and we shouldn't penalize a candidate who uses an accurate, if basic, emotion simply because it lacks a polite veneer.
But efficiency completely falls apart the moment the conversation turns abstract. This is exactly where the danger of your efficiency argument becomes glaringly apparent.
How so?
Well, later in the test, we are no longer talking about personal hobbies or past experiences. The exam forces candidates to handle abstract concepts, societal issues, and crucially, direct disagreements. When an examiner hands you a controversial societal issue, brutal efficiency suddenly just sounds brutal.
But it is clear.
If an examiner proposes an idea and you reply, I think that's a bad idea, or that's not how it works, yes, that is efficient. It is incredibly direct, but it shuts the door in the examiner's face.
See, I look at that entirely differently. It is a clear, unambiguous thesis statement. In any kind of academic or intellectual discourse, clarity of position is highly valued. You know exactly what the speaker believes.
You know what they believe, yeah, but it is a linguistic dead end. It shuts down the conversation rather than inviting exploration. It gives you nowhere to go grammatically.
I don't know if I agree that it gives you nowhere to go.
Well, look at the polite frames suggested by the source material. Things like, I have some reservations about that idea. I'm not entirely convinced it would work. Or, I see what you're saying, but I found that it often works differently in practice.
Those are definitely more complex.
Right, and they aren't just polite. They demonstrate a capacity for nuanced, complex thinking that the blunt, efficient response completely lacks. It proves to the examiner that you understand abstract issues are rarely black and white.
Let's ground this in the environmental example provided in the text, because I think it highlights the flaw in over-policing tone. The proposition is, we should just ban all plastic use.
Okay, yeah.
Now that is a strong, clear, declarative position. Why should a candidate dilute their own argument? Why should they back away from a confident assertion just to appease a perceived requirement for social softness?
They aren't backing away from it.
Well, the material suggests changing it to, while I understand the sentiment behind banning plastic use entirely, I think we need to consider the broader implications and perhaps focus on more targeted solutions. Now, that is certainly a mouthful.
It's a great sentence.
It is a highly complex sentence, sure, utilizing a subordinate clause to establish a concession before delivering the main point. But my major concern is that it dilutes the actual opinion. It sounds exactly like a politician dodging a tough question on television rather than a student answering one.
Oh, come on, it doesn't dilute the opinion at all. It demonstrates the intellectual maturity to hold two competing ideas simultaneously. That is exactly what high-level language assessment is designed to test.
By sounding like a politician?
By sounding diplomatic. If you just say, we should ban all plastic, you are just pushing a pawn straight forward on a chessboard. It is basic, it is linear, and it is incredibly easy for the examiner to block. The forward momentum stops immediately.
A pawn is still a move.
But a polite disagreement, saying, that's an interesting angle, though I've noticed that different cultures have unique perspectives on this. That is a knight's move. You are approaching the conceptual problem laterally. You demonstrate flexibility. You move the conversation forward, acknowledging the obstacle without slamming into it head-on, and you do so without sounding confrontational.
The knight is a tricky piece, though, and that is exactly where my reservation lies.
How so?
The knight's move requires significantly more calculation than pushing a pawn. If a candidate is focused entirely on constructing this elaborate, polite disagreement, they are drastically increasing their cognitive load in real time. They might stumble over the actual grammar of the sentence because they are trying so hard to be diplomatic.
Well, yes, it's harder.
Their direct approach, the pawn moving forward, minimizes the risk of structural errors. If you try to say, while I understand the sentiment behind, and you completely mangle the grammar in the second half of the sentence, the examiner is not going to reward you for your polite intention. They are going to mark you down heavily for the grammatical failure.
That's true.
The ambition of politeness introduces a massive, often unnecessary, high risk of error. That is a completely fair warning. It does carry risk. But if you don't take the risk of the knight's move, you are artificially capping your own score.
Capping it?
Yes, you simply can't reach the upper echelons of fluency and coherence by only moving pawns. You have to demonstrate the ability to navigate complex social and intellectual terrain, and the language of politeness is literally the map for that terrain.
Which brings us perfectly to the actual mechanical scoring rubrics themselves. We are talking about fluency, coherence, lexical resource, and pronunciation.
Right.
Let's synthesize everything we've discussed and examine the ultimate before and after scenario presented in the source material as the climax of this entire strategy. The direct, abrupt statement is, I disagree with that idea, it's not practical.
Very blunt?
And the polite alternative is, I understand where you're coming from, but I have some reservations about that idea. I'm not entirely convinced it would work.
The difference in the impression it leaves on the listener is striking, isn't it?
It is certainly longer, and I will readily concede it is more grammatically complex. It uses idiomatic phrases like where you're coming from and collocations like entirely convinced.
Exactly.
But here is where I question the underlying mechanics of what is actually happening in the exam room, right in that moment. Is this genuine, spontaneous coherence, or is it merely a memorized template?
Well,
The text gives another example. I've given this a lot of thought, and I believe that if a candidate is asked an incredibly complex question about a controversial topic, and they immediately deploy that exact phrase, are they actually demonstrating linguistic proficiency, or are they just buying time?
oh, they are definitely buying time.
Are they padding their answer with polite filler while they frantically search their brain for something to actually say?
Buying time is exactly the point. I think you just hit on the exact mechanism that makes this strategy so powerful. You call it buying time, I call it a cognitive buffer. Think of politeness as a socially acceptable loading screen for your brain.
A socially acceptable loading screen? Explain how a loading screen fits into the grading rubric.
Think about what happens to the brain under pressure. We know that in a high-stakes exam, lexical retrieval, literally the time it takes your brain to find the right words, takes milliseconds longer. Panic sets in.
Oh, definitely.
Imagine you're in the chair, and the examiner asks you about the economic impact of urban infrastructure. If you try to answer directly and efficiently, you are going to freeze. You will hit a long, awkward, silent pause.
And silence hurts the score.
Silence absolutely destroys your fluency score. But when a candidate starts a complex response with a polite frame like, I completely understand where you're coming from, but I have some reservations, you just bought yourself 3 or 4 critical seconds of silence-free thinking time.
So while your mouth is running on autopilot with a polite phrase, your working memory is building the actual argument.
Exactly. In those 4 seconds, your working memory is formulating the complex grammar and vocabulary that will follow in the second half of the sentence. You aren't just being polite, you are actively hacking the fluency rubric.
Wow.
You are protecting your score by avoiding the silence, and at the same time, you are setting up a complex sentence structure with a dependent and independent clause, which satisfies the coherence and grammatical range rubrics, because you've just proved to the examiner you can juggle multiple complex thoughts in real time without dropping the ball.
That is a fascinating, almost ruthlessly mechanical view of fluency. You are saying politeness is essentially a highly strategic stalling tactic that is formally rewarded by the rubric.
But isn't that exactly how native speakers operate in the real world? We do this all the time. We use polite framing devices constantly to gather our thoughts before delivering a substantive critique or a complex explanation.
That's fair.
If I ask you a hard question right now, you won't just blurt out the answer. You'll say, well, that's an interesting way to look at it, but it's not just artificial fluff. It is the natural scaffolding of human speech. When the source text highlights that polite language makes a candidate sound more natural and sophisticated, it is referring exactly to this rhythm.
The rhythm of it?
Yeah, it's the rhythm of acknowledgement, consideration, and then assertion. It mimics the natural cadence of high-level intellectual discourse perfectly.
I will absolutely acknowledge that avoiding unnatural pauses or severe hesitations is a vital component of the fluency rubric. If polite phrasing serves as a functional, structural tool to maintain speech continuity while the brain processes the next thought, your loading screen concept, then it clearly has a measurable strategic value.
Exactly.
However, the caveat must remain absolute. If the second half of that sentence, the actual payload that comes after the cognitive buffer, is empty or grammatically broken, the entire strategy collapses.
Oh, absolutely.
The examiner will see right through a polite introduction that leads to a dead end. The buffer only works if there is actual, substantive data being buffered.
We are completely aligned on that. The politeness absolutely cannot be a mask for a lack of vocabulary or a lack of ideas. It has to be the delivery system for them. It is the runway that allows the complex thought to take off smoothly. You still need an airplane.
To summarize my position in light of our deep dive into the mechanics here, while the polite examples we've analyzed from the material are undeniably better, more complex English,
Test takers need to be incredibly precise about why they score higher.
Right.
You must ensure you are using these refined phrases to add genuine descriptive nuance, to demonstrate actual emotional precision, and to manage the flow of your argument. You can't simply memorize polite templates like, "I've given this a lot of thought," and expect a higher score if the thought itself is non-existent.
Spot on.
The good manners are not a substitute for linguistic proficiency. They are merely one avenue to display it. Directness still has its place for absolute clarity, and candidates shouldn't be afraid to be concise when the situation specifically demands efficient information transfer.
And to summarize my perspective, politeness in the IELTS speaking test is fundamentally a strategic tool, and honestly, perhaps one of the most underutilized ones out there. It is not just about avoiding rudeness or adhering to an arbitrary standard of social etiquette.
No, it's a structural tool.
Exactly. It is about deliberately elevating the presentation of your vocabulary, your fluency, your coherence, and your pronunciation. By choosing respectful, nuanced phrasing over blunt directness, you inherently force yourself to use the sophisticated language structures that the higher band scores explicitly demand.
I see that now.
The desire to be polite acts as a catalyst for advanced grammar. It transforms you from someone who is merely surviving a test into a sophisticated communicator, engaging in a dynamic, intellectual dialogue.
You know, it seems we've actually reached a really valuable point of convergence today. Whether you view it purely as a mechanism for social etiquette, as you initially framed it, or as a highly structural linguistic strategy, a cognitive buffer to protect fluency, as we eventually defined it, the outcome is largely the exact same.
It really is.
Replacing abrupt, simple language with considered, respectful phrasing inevitably results in a more natural, more complex, and ultimately more impressive performance on the test.
The architecture of the language simply flows better when the design is thoughtful. It is incredibly valuable to look at language testing through multiple lenses like this, moving beyond just staring at vocabulary lists.
Definitely.
To our listeners who are preparing for their own assessments, try incorporating these polite, lateral knights moves into your daily conversations. Notice how it changes not just what people hear, but the actual structural words you are forced to reach for in your own mind. There is so much more nuance to explore in your own practice. After all, if communication is a building, wouldn't you want to design one that people actually want to walk through?